Well, it looks like most people came back, or you weren't here last week, or you're doing something else. Because last week I was busy with verse 12, taking some time to justify God saying, "And women rule over my people." In chapter 3, verse 12. I know it's a tough one. That many people would look at and say, well, you know, you're going to have to explain why God would say something like that, and you're going to have to explain it away, and you're going to have to apologize for God, that kind of thing. And so I gave a different message. I explained that under the circumstances is not like a punishment per se, more like in this circumstance it would be more suitable as rulers, more suitable. I explained that one of the advantages that the ladies can have on occasion is they can be a little bit better at the redistribution of wealth than men. You know, us dads will bring home this large amount of resources, and then we give it to our wives, and our wives will redistribute it. Which can sometimes be better, because sometimes us guys can have a tendency to do things like, well, let's check your chore chart and see what is the value of the labor that you have been performing, and you'll be compensated accordingly. And that's not always the best model to use within a household. There can be an occasion for that, of course, but it's just that ladies can be a little bit more suitable with the breadth of thinking to be redistributing things. But what happens in civilizations is that eventually a civilization will break down to the point where people will run out of ways of taking things from somebody else, and so they'll sometimes make a declaration that we are now all one big happy family. And so whoever has anything that anybody can find, we're going to take it and we're going to redistribute it a little bit more aggressively. And when you end up with a model such as that, sometimes the ladies can be much more suitable for the redistribution of wealth, and that's what I was describing last week, that they should be in charge. Now, part of that has to do with the people. It doesn't have to do with the leadership, and this can be confusing sometimes to people. It can be very confusing. Sometimes we make the assumption that we just need the right person in charge. Well, the person who's in charge, they're put in charge, or they're in charge most of the time because the people want them to be in charge. You know, if you were to take a look at our present leadership in our civilization in this region of the world, for example, take a good look at the leadership that's there, and I personally, I really believe that they're a very good reflection of the people who are around us. And I know you might find that a little bit surprising. It's probably because you've spent a lot of your time with people who are not like that. You know, because maybe you're not like that either. But if you will, expand your involvement a little bit more, maybe if you spend more time with people who you don't like, for example, then you might discover that the vast majority of people who are around you are just like the people who are in leadership positions. One way to measure that is by asking them, well, if you were in that leadership position, would you do anything different? And they'll say, no. Or ask people who they voted for, and then you can take a survey in that way, and you'll discover that they are like that. So the same thing within a church. You know, it's not just within the civilization, but within the institutions of the civilization, where people are not necessarily mandated to be participants. But if you take a look at any congregation and you consider the leadership there, then you'll discover that the people are quite often, they're a reflection of the leadership. They really are just the same. Now you have to be careful with that, because it's not always the case. Like here. Okay, for example. It is, yeah, okay. It depends on how you look at it. There's another way to look at it where you have to be very careful, because it turns out that just like you have the redistribution of wealth within a civilization, you can also have the redistribution of faith in a church. And that can work just fine in most congregations. But when you have something like this, redistribution of faith isn't going to work out very well. Because the faith that I personally have, for example, is not something that I can redistribute. You know, I mean, if I had a lot of money, I could redistribute that. But with a lot of faith, it can't be redistributed. In other places where their faith is different from mine, you can redistribute that, because it's the kind of faith that, in my opinion, is fairly empty. So you can redistribute emptiness. All right, you can redistribute nothing a lot easier than you can redistribute something. So you have to be cautious with that. That's what I'm going to be spending some time talking about today. Now, what I've done is I've passed out some notes concerning what I'm going to be talking about. I didn't do this last week because the part of the verse that I was talking about, there's nothing to say. You know, I mean, it's pretty straightforward. I can't say that this is a major translational problem and I'm now here to fix it. So I didn't bother with that. Not to mention that you'd have to then bring what I handed out to you today back this week, and you may forget to do that, or you might just dispose of it anyway. I don't know if that I'll cover, I'm pretty sure I'm not going to cover everything that I handed out today, so bring that next week. So you'll have that next week, and I can alleviate some pressure there also. But if you take a look at what I handed out, you'll notice that there is a big difference at the beginning of what I wrote compared to what we have in other translations. I'm going to start out in the New King James Version in verse 12. In Isaiah chapter 3, verse 12, where it says, "As for my people, children are their oppressors." And then goes on and says, "And women rule over them. O my people, those who lead you cause you to err and destroy the way of your paths." Now, I've talked, in 2 weeks ago, I think it was, I did talk a little bit about children oppressing and mentioned some things about that. But I'd like to tell you that what it says there in what I just read is wrong. I mean, in some cases, I can say that it's close, or it's correct, or it's pretty good, you know. But in this case, let's just deal with it right away. It doesn't say that at all. It says something completely different at the beginning of verse 12. A better rendition of this would be to say that the things people have done are taskmasters over my people. That the things that people have done. Now, the word that they translated into, they are their oppressors. Children are their oppressors. That's the word taskmasters in what I wrote. But if you might wonder, well, where is the children? I'll tell you that they're just not there. All right? I mean, we have different words in Hebrew for children, and the one that they translated here, I don't think it's appropriate to translate from children point of view. To me, a better translation of that word would be to say the things that they have done. Now, children can be the things that you've done. You could say that. I can relate to it from that point of view. That's fine. But I think that takes away from what this could say if you weren't to narrow things down like that. The things that people have done have become the taskmasters over the people, and therefore have put themselves in a situation where it's more appropriate for the women to be ruling. Right? It's the things that people have done. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about this from the fleshly point of view, and then I can talk about this from the spiritual point of view to get you to understand why people would begin to turn to the redistribution of faith. All right? Instead of building their own, having their own, being responsible for their own. It can be quite a complication. Now, let's deal with this from a children point of view for just a moment, just in order to make it easier, and in case you're really concerned about the way I translated this, you really want the children to still be there. All right, we'll stick them in there in an abstract way. One of the things that you can normally understand when it comes to children, if you have children, is that they do some bizarre things sometimes. You know, they do some things that will result in consequences. Now, here's the choice that has to be made. When you have children and they do things that are bad, wrong, or destructive, or whatever, there's going to be a consequence of some kind. And the decision that a parent has to make is who is going to suffer the consequences. That's the decision that normally has to be made. Now, if it's a destructive thing that affects somebody else, well, then that other person has already suffered the consequences. You know, if the little baby picks up a block and throws it at one of its siblings and hits them in the nose, then it's going to hurt, and that child who has been injured has suffered the consequences. And there really isn't anything you're going to be able to do about that at that point. Somebody's hurting, it probably will go away in time, but you can't take that block away and remove that hurt as if it had never occurred. And in that case, consequences, there's no choice in that matter, right? Except for the choice of what you're going to do to the one who threw the block. Now there's a choice to be made. So in some cases, there's no choice about who's going to suffer the consequences. But in this case, but beyond that, there are other circumstances when a choice can be made with regards to whether that child is going to suffer consequences or not. Now the parent will then have to decide, is the child going to understand the consequences that we express to them? If it's a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old, then it's possible. And you might try something that would give them the indication that they are going to suffer consequences. If they are not going to experience any consequences, then the one who absorbed the impact of that block is going to just simply have to suffer all of the consequences related to that. And now there are going to be more consequences that other people are going to have to experience, such as fear. Now, if that sibling or other children, or maybe even the parents now, are going to now have to live in fear, live in absolute terror, whenever that other little one picks up a block. Because who knows who's going to get hit next? All right? Do you see how there's a deferment of consequence? That the little one either suffers the consequences, or everybody else is going to have to absorb those consequences. And in this case, it can be reflected as a form of fear. We now live with a terrorist, and no one will do anything about it. Who now has the freedom and liberty to terrorize us as much as they personally desire. All right? And they can become, quite creative. And you might think that maybe they'll outgrow it, but no. It morphs into more sophisticated ways. Instead of being a 3-year-old way, it becomes a 5-year-old way, and then a 10-year-old way, and then a 15-year-old way. And it morphs, okay, until it gets addressed. And so consequences are going to be experienced by somebody. All right? They're going to be experienced by somebody, either the person who created the circumstance, or it's going to be experienced by those who had nothing to do with those circumstances, but now get to live with terrorism. Just to give you a simple example. So there are always consequences in life, and we have, to some degree, we have hope that one day, as children are growing up, they will learn to absorb consequences for their own decisions. We have hope that they will do that for the decisions of what they do, and the decisions, especially, of what they do not do. Both. Because if they don't get in touch with those things early, and get educated and adapt and learn how to be a part of the miniature civilization that the family is, then when they finally go out into the real civilization, either due to the eviction from their parents or their unwillingness to tolerate their parents, maybe their parents eventually invoke something like a rule. And if that happens after a certain age, that can be so stressful for the child that they just simply will never adapt. Okay? And don't laugh, because this is real, all right? I hope you're laughing because you can identify with this. All right, so this happens. We should deal with these things early, because the longer you delay, the more difficult it is, and eventually, due to terrorism or divorce or other things in life, the children will discover that they are now a part of this world as adults, and they are going to face the reality of consequences for the decisions that they make about what they do or they don't do. So, what's the easy way out? All they need to do is find someone that they can saddle and ride like a donkey. Right? They just need to get married. Okay? Just marry them off, find somebody else who will suffer all of the consequences for, all of the decisions that they make. All right? That's the easy way out, to pass them off to the in-laws or the outlaws, or someone else. Send them into the military. That's one way to handle it. Let the military absorb all the consequences related to that and see how that goes. There are various. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with going to the military. People can do that from different points of view. I'm just saying that this is one of the ways that people will resolve these matters. So that's what I mean, is that they find someone else who will absorb the consequences, and this just ends badly. All right, it just ends in a lot of suffering and destruction and turmoil. And relationships of people that just fail and collapse. I mean, it's just an ugly way of life. It really is. And so I would like to encourage you, considering all of that if you have children and you have some authority over them of some kind, which is not always the same thing, right, to invoke consequences for actions in such a way that people will be able to learn how to be adults. Right? Learn how to be adults. Very important. To suffer is sometimes very important in order to learn how to be an adult and to learn how to be a part of the civilization that you are in. And if you fail with regards to that, you're going to have to find someone else who will suffer those consequences usually. But what will happen? What will eventually happen? There will be oppression. And there will be a taskmaster of some kind. Let me give you an example. You will eventually, just to give you a simple example, you can probably relate to this, where there have been children who have become adults and they found someone to marry who will take care of them in some way. And then eventually you find that the relationship is very poor. Not always, but it can be very destructive, and the person can feel like they are being oppressed, like they are enslaved in some way. Why? Because they can't leave, or because this person is a mean person. I mean, there's various reasons why a person might feel like they are under great oppression. But one of the words that could be described is as a taskmaster in some way. That the person who actually has possession of the means of production is the one who ends up really being in charge. And normally it's just a matter of time before this is discovered. Right? It's that matter of time before it's discovered that the person who is the means of production actually does have a degree of authority. Eventually they get tired of the terrorism, for example, and they just decide, I'm going to invoke some authority here, and I'm going to do it this way. Things are going to change, or I'm just not going to work for this anymore. Just to give you an example. They just decide, I'm just not going to work for this. I'll just quit. And you all can find some way to get along and move on with life. All right? That's what you'll sometimes see. People will just decide, I'm just tired. I'm just done, and I'm just not going to do this anymore. And then things break down. There's a huge breakdown. Now, what happens in a civilization that looks to the greater scope of family, of government? Well, if the government decides to supply the people with the things that they need, then the people become dependent on the government, and then the government becomes the taskmaster over the people. They are the ones who become in control. They are the ones who end up in a position of authority, end up in a position of power. Okay, for example, certainly by now you probably know a few people who could not feed themselves, who could not provide themselves with a place to live, clothing to wear, or energy, or much of anything, unless the government provided that for them. Okay, there are enough people in our civilization right now. You should know someone who's in that kind of a circumstance. All right, what does this mean? This means that they have to do everything that the government tells them to do, or they won't get those things anymore. or they're in a circumstance where they have to have certain people in power who will continue to dispense those things, or else they won't be able to survive. So the government becomes the taskmaster, it becomes the slave owner, and you become a slave. It becomes a form of bondage, a form of slavery. You know, there's a history to this. This word taskmaster, if you haven't recognized it or not, it's the same word that was used in Egypt over the children of Israel. The Israelites. It's the exact same word that was used in order to describe the people who enslaved the Israelites. That's why I think it's better to translate it that way. Not that the children are oppressing them, but the children have, not the children, there's no children there. What the people decided to do has become a taskmaster over them as if they are enslaved in the same way that the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites. And the Egyptians were, for the most part, enslaved by the Pharaoh themselves. How did that happen? How did the slavery take place? It was just over something to eat. It was over food. It was over a famine. What happened, right? There was a famine in the land. Now, of course, there was a vision that was given through the Lord so that the Pharaoh was properly informed that they should put some of the produce aside and store it. When there are times of plenty, you put things aside when there are times of little. It's simple, right? Now, most people just assume good times will never end, and so they never put aside anything for the bad times. And then they eventually become slaves of some kind for somebody. All right? But when it comes to the good times, the Pharaoh made the decision to put things aside, but for who? For him. All right, you know, for the people, yes, in an abstract way, but this is how it worked out. First, the people had to come and give their gold for all the food. So they did that. They ran out of gold. Then they gave their livestock, if I remember. No, not their livestock. I can't. Sorry, I should have reviewed this earlier, right? They gave all of their stuff up until the point where they gave their land. Now, at the point of giving your land, you're done. That's why they said, just take us as slaves. Because if you have no land, you have no place to be. And you have no ability to produce any wealth without ownership of land. There's just no way to do that. Well, it's very difficult to accomplish that if you don't have ownership of the land that you are living on, that you're using in order to produce things with. This is the model of slavery. And we are seeing the same model of slavery used again. It's just being done with different names. You know, with plastic cards. It's a different model, but it's the same result, the exact same thing. And how did this happen? It's because of the decisions that people make. The decisions that people make, that's it. The things of people's doings, which would be a more literal translation of this. I wrote, the things people have done, because it's in the past tense. The things that people have done have become the taskmasters, or the things that people have not done. Either way, it's a doing. It's a decision that people make. All right, and so it's very important to understand this from the world's perspective and from a fleshly point of view, because if you don't get in touch with these things, it's only a matter of time before either you or your generations following, which perhaps you don't care about, your children or grandchildren or whoever, it's only a matter of time before there is slavery. And slavery is an awful thing. And having taskmasters over you is an awful thing per se. Unless you believe that, you know, maybe they'll be benevolent in some way, but it doesn't usually turn out that way. All right, so you must get in touch with basic consequences and understand the decisions that you make. Let me talk about two extremes. All right, the first extreme, debt. Debt can quickly become a taskmaster. Simple extreme. I won't spend a lot of time with this because you probably have plenty of it already, and you probably can, understand this. When it comes to debt, people make a decision to borrow the money. That's something that they do. And because of that decision, they become a slave to whoever it is that loaned them the money. I mean, have you not seen the bumper sticker? Or maybe we need to make some more or something, because I haven't seen one for a while. But there used to be, you know, these great bumper stickers that said things like, I owe, so off to work I go. You know, something to that effect. You've got to go and find work. You've got to go find a job. You've got to find some way of obtaining the resources that you need in order to pay for what you have. I can relate to this. I have a house that I've got my wife and kids in right now that I don't own. You know, I mean, they say I do, I suppose. I own the debt, which means that I owe the debt. Okay? I have borrowed a lot of money. I had to. I borrowed money in order to pay for this, and I only have a matter of time. I've got a week left, for example, right now, before I have to pay the bank for you know, the privilege of being there, or my wife and kids have got to go find somewhere else to live. I will do my best to help them, but if I can't do this now, then that's what it comes down to. You understand? All right. So debt can be a taskmaster. It is the taskmaster that tells me in the morning when I wake up, or when the alarm wakes me up, or somebody wakes me up. When I wake up, this taskmaster, this little taskmaster per se, who says, "Aaron, you've got to get up and you've got to work, and you have to produce something of value." All right, and you have to be, you know, that somebody will compensate you for, or you know, your wife and kids are going to have to go look for somewhere else to live. All right, there's a taskmaster associated with that. Okay, what about things that we do not do? That's a form of what we do. We just decide that we will borrow. But what about things that we do not do? Let's take the other extreme. Retirement. That's something that you've got to do. You've got to do something in order to prepare for the days when you can't do anything else. Now, I understand that, you know, retirement is not exactly a biblical concept per se, in the sense that we don't have any chapter or verse that we could necessarily refer to and create, you know, this whole a seminar on retirement stuff. Not really, but you know, retirement. There will come a day when I will not be able to do what I am able to do now. The day is coming. I don't know when that's going to happen, but the day is coming when I am not going to be able to do the kind of work that I am doing. I physically won't be able to do it. You know, right now, most of the work that I'm doing involves teaching. And, you know, eventually, I'm probably going to get tired. I'm going to stutter. Maybe I'll lose my ability to speak with a stroke or something. You know, we've got people who we know who have suffered from things like that. This is not an unusual experience. What happens if I can't talk anymore? What am I going to do then, right? Okay, there are other skills that I have that I can turn to, but what if I didn't have those skills? Well, even the skills that I do have, you know, there are limits. You know, I've got some great skills, but it could take me 2 to 4 years to get involved in some of those skills that I have in order to produce something of greater value than what I invest into it. For example, technology. I mean, I have a lot of ideas concerning different technologies that I could develop and produce. Maybe they'd be of value. Maybe I would actually be compensated for that. But there's a lot of uncertainty there. You know, but we're talking 2 to 4 years worth of labor, of work, and I might not live that long. You know, if I find myself in a situation where I'm just so old, you know, I'm not going to make it another 3 years. You know, am I going to engage in a project that won't show any return for 4 or 5 years? Yeah, this is not necessarily going to be a good idea in order to deal with the needs that I will have for help and assistance and food and other things as I'm spending the last days of my life. There's other things that don't require that kind of effort. You know, I'm pretty good with a shovel. You know, I mean, I can really move some dirt with a shovel. That might sound a little surprising to some of you, but I can. You know, I mean, I can really work a shovel. Well, the day is coming when I'm not going to be able to work a shovel like I can. All right, it isn't going to happen. Last night, I worked a shovel for about 2 hours, and I felt felt like I had moved it for 8 hours 10 years ago. 10 years from now, if I work a shovel for 15 minutes, you know, I'm going to... So, you know, that's not necessarily a good thing to depend on. Because I'm not going to be able to compete with others who can move a shovel for 8 hours and that volume of material. You understand? Retirement has to be planned. It has to be prepared for. All right, so how do you prepare for that? It's simple. You start today and you try to put aside enough for one day. Then you know that the last day of your life will be, manageable. And then you work for day 2. Okay, and at some point from the end of your life to the present day, hopefully someday the ends will meet. And if they do, then you can consider yourself to be quite fortunate. And if they don't, you're going to have to find someone else who will make up for the difference. All right? There isn't anything more to say about it, except that it is a taskmaster. It will be a very brutal taskmaster in the end if you decide to do nothing. Because whoever is going to make up for the difference is going to have some things to say about it. Whoever makes up for the difference will be able to make decisions for you about what you're going to do, what you're not going to do, and how you're going to manage your life, etc. What you're going to eat, what you're not going to eat, what the temperature and the thermostat's going to be. All right? That's what I mean by the taskmasters that we will encounter. Some sooner than later. All right? That we will encounter if we do not pay attention to those things. So those are the two extremes that I wanted to mention. All right, now, when it comes to religion, same thing. All right? The world of religion is filled with taskmasters, and people make decisions about the taskmasters and the form of bondage that they will be in all the time. Just by definition of the word. Religion, a system of bondage. As the basic definition of the word of religion, it is a system, religio. It's a system of bondage which has to be defined by a system of law, which means that this is what you do, this is what you don't do. Can you smell the taskmaster? All right, and what happens when somebody goes and visits some congregation of some kind? All right, they get in there, and it's only a matter of time before they meet their taskmaster. It's only a matter of time before they get the list of what they can do and the list of what they can't do. And who makes those decisions? You know, well, people will say things like, well, it's God. It's the Word of God. You know, put it on Him. And in many ways they can be correct in terms of the definition of what is good and evil, correct in terms of the law. But they're imposing laws and commandments on people that they cannot possibly fulfill. Right? Because we know, according to the New Covenant, that the flesh will never obey the law. That we can never obey the law, we can never fulfill the law. But don't worry. We have taskmasters who will beat us as much as is necessary in order to get us to conform in whatever way they possibly can. Right? And that's what it looks like. And that's what it becomes. And it's because of a decision that these people make. Not the taskmasters in this context. It's not forced. It's the people who make the decision. They make a choice to do something, to believe something. And because of what they do and what they believe, they will oppress themselves. All right? And this is why leadership, people who are in leadership positions in these kinds of congregational environments don't have a lot of guilt. All right? They don't have a lot of remorse. They're not going to feel bad because they're giving the people exactly what they want. And they get paid to do it. Isn't that twisted? I mean, it's absolutely twisted. But if you ever wonder, why is it that when this person gets confronted, you probably have confronted somebody, right? Surely you've confronted some pastor, leader of church of some kind. You've confronted with them with what you discovered is the truth. And they brushed it off like what you said was nothing. Like they didn't care. They may have even agreed with you and said, oh, okay, yeah, you're right. But so, I'm still going to lie to these people. Now, if you haven't encountered that, maybe you should. Maybe you should get out there. It's not hard to find people who will express that kind of an attitude. All right, that's the kind of person that you need in order to support an institutional, organizational system such as that. So it's the people who make the choice to oppress themselves, to create taskmasters themselves. All right, now who's going to distribute? Who's going to distribute this oppression? Sometimes some people are more suitable to distribute this oppression than others. Which is where he goes on from there, but I'm not going to go in that direction today. Instead, where was I going to go? Consequences. Consequences with regards to what people believe. So, when people pursue this religious stuff, right, they're going to experience great catastrophic consequences. Okay? Great consequences. So what is the natural thing for people to do? The natural thing for people to do in the fleshly attitude is to find someone else who will absorb or who will suffer the consequences. So what is the most common way for people to do this? Surely you've heard. I mean, I'd be surprised if you haven't heard somebody say something like, well, we don't bother studying the Bible a whole lot because that's what the pastor does. All right? I mean, one day when I somehow, woke up in the synagogue and I started to bring this subject up with the people who I was a part of, things like, maybe we should be reading the Torah ourselves. People would say, no, that's what the rabbi does. Okay, that was my first encounter. I mean, so certainly, so when I went into the Christian world and I found out that people had that kind of an attitude there, I mean, yeah, can you get some kind of an idea of just how upset I was? When I thought, well, I've discovered the truth, and the truth is Jesus, and we are responsible for ourselves, and we grow in our own faith, and the faith is ours, and it's a relationship between us and our God. And I go out in the Christian world, and I find that people are doing the exact same thing. Well, that's the pastor's job. We defer the consequences to him. And people will say, well, I'm going to stay close to the pastor because if anybody's going to get hit by the lightning, it's going to have to be him. Because he's the one. He's the guy in charge. He's the one who is studying the Bible on our behalf. He's the one who's going to spend the time to answer all the questions that we have. He's going to be responsible before God. And so we'll just stay close to him. It's a deferment of consequence. It's the same thing where people will say, I don't want to grow up. I'd just like to stay a babe in Christ. Just keep me as a child of God. Okay? In this abstraction. It becomes a problem. We are to grow, we are to mature, but people don't want to do it because it's so much easier to just simply say, well, I don't want to suffer the consequences related to whatever that might be, and so I'll just let somebody else suffer the consequences. And there are people who are gladly able and willing to absorb those for a price. You got to pay them. And when the money's gone, they go too. Right? In that kind of a structure, they're not going to work themselves into a heart attack in order to provide all the resources so people can look to them as being the ones who are going to be the providers of faith so it can be redistributed amongst the congregation. All right, but that's what people do. When they say, I am not going to be responsible for my own faith, I'm going to find someone else who will be responsible for faith. You end up shifting the consequences in this abstraction over to them. They become the taskmaster over you. And then you have a very awkward, codependent relationship between the congregation and the leadership that just ends with nothing. But like I said, don't worry. That way we can justify the redistribution of faith. It's easy to do because there isn't anything to distribute anyway, except for empty promises or empty whatever, or words that people throw around that we know are supposed to have some meaning of some kind, but we don't know what they are. We don't know what the meaning is. All right? So that's what happens. What happens is that when people don't grow up and mature in the flesh, it becomes very easy for them not to grow up and mature when they are confronted with the adult issues of life which have to do with knowing your God or not. It becomes a very difficult barrier for people to get past. Now, consequences become even more complicated. They become even greater obstacles over time. The longer you wait, the more complex they become. Let me give you an example. It's not unusual for me to get a letter or even a phone call from somebody and they say things like, you know, I've been listening to you for a while and I want to believe the things that you're believing, but I'm not sure I want to experience the consequences of that. Now, at this point, you know, this is serious, isn't it? I mean, you can talk about all the issues related to the flesh, and then you can talk about the issues related to religion, and the consequences are pretty severe, right? But when we get down to something as serious as this, we're talking about eternity at this point. It's no longer an issue of whether you're going to feed your flesh from, you know, a bacon double cheeseburger point of view, or whatever, or whether you're going to feed your flesh from a religious point of view, through hoping that somebody's going to redistribute their faith to you in some empty, abstract way. But now, at this point, we end up dealing with, you know, the serious issues of the eternal nature of who we are, and the issues of whether we are going to know our God or not. And people struggle deeply with the consequences related to this. For example, if you believe what I tell you about the forgiveness of sins, if you believe that, you're going to have to, if you're part of a church that doesn't believe that, you're going to have to leave the church. Eventually, you're either going to leave voluntarily or they're going to push you out. Okay, directly or indirectly, you're going to be pushed out. At some point, it's not going to work. Are you willing to accept that kind of a consequence? And there's a lot of people who say no. So what do? Well, they just kind of believe it, but they won't tell anybody about it because they know that they're going to be kicked out. What about their family relationships? Not just their church relationships. How about their family relationships? Well, the same thing. You know, you can be shoved out. You won't be welcome at the next holiday party or holiday get-together. You know, the next Christmas season, you won't see as many presents with your name on it. All right. I mean, you can really suffer some tremendous consequences. You can be written. You can be. Your name can be blotted out of the will over that. You know, and that's a serious consequence. You know, I'll never forget, you know, the day when my mother expressed that to me, per se. You know, when she pretty much expressed to me that I'm just not going to be receiving the family inheritance. And I had to make a decision. Is it worth it? You know, my father made it easy. He said I wouldn't get one anyway, so that's easy to do. Oh, there's a lot to be said about that, but listen, you know, there are all kinds of consequences in the family relationships that you have. What about your work? You know, what about the relationships that you have with other people that require some kind of common belief, some kind of common faith? Okay, the work that people do sometimes is connected to that. That if you don't get along with the people who you work with, they're going to push you out, you know, in some way. Or the kind of employment that you have, you just simply may not feel comfortable being involved in that anymore. You know, maybe your form of employment depends on committing fraud. You know, and even though the government allows you to do it, you just don't feel like doing it anymore. Maybe you're the one who deals cards at the gambling casino, you know, or helps people lose their money in various ways, and you just don't feel comfortable being involved in that anymore. So the consequences of you believing things that are true and real may be so great that you're not willing to suffer those kinds of consequences. And if you have not built any sense of integrity or fortitude up to this point in the natural issues related to life, what's it going to take? Where is it going to come from? How are you going to withstand the consequences related to the beliefs that you have? What about personal pride? I'm dealing with somebody right now who's relatively old in years. They're coming to the end of their life, and they've spent the majority of their life teaching people to live under the law. And they've been confronted with some things that I have said, and this is just last week. They wrote me and they said, you know what? I think you're right, but I don't think that I can follow through with believing and embracing what you're saying because the consequences are unbearable, because all these people who I've been teaching these things to all these years, this just isn't going to look good. I mean, it's just not going to look good at all. How am I going to cope with the fact that I've been lying to these people all this time? And how are we as people having relationships with each other going to cope with each other when I explain this to them and they realize that I've wasted their life just like I've wasted mine? Now, can you sense the weakness that a person has? I mean, tremendous weakness that they have, that they cannot embrace the truth. You end up making a choice. This is the choice that you make, and it depends on what your taskmaster is going to be. According to this, you make a choice to either stay in the world, and what I mean by the world in this sense is either the world of the indulgence of the flesh or the religious world of the restraint of the flesh. You stay in that. And you experience the taskmasters either through the indulgence of the flesh, which is pretty clear and obvious, or the restraint of the flesh, the taskmasters being trying to live a life that you never will. Or you live under the taskmaster of the living God who expresses to you the truth. And you live according to the truth. Now the Lord said, take upon my burden, for my burden is easy, it's light. Alright, it's going to be easy, especially compared to what you have. And so it's not like it completely evaporates, like you have no taskmaster at all. It's just, we got a really good one. Right? We got a nice one. He tells us the truth, we live by the truth. Certainly there are consequences related to that. But when you consider the magnitude of those consequences, it's not that bad. It really isn't. Now for me, it was difficult because I didn't see ahead. I couldn't see ahead. Well, how could I live my life without the expectation of an inheritance in the future? Okay, how can I live my life with being completely disconnected from future employment that I was hoping to obtain? Right? I mean, I got to find a new line of work. Who's going to hire me as a rabbi? I mean, they made it clear. This is how it was expressed to me. I'm sorry, but we're not going to be able to complete your training. You're not going to be given our endorsement as a rabbi because we just can't have a rabbi who's a Jew for Jesus. I said, but I'm not a member of that organization. It didn't help. Okay? Future employment. Future potential of wealth, which there isn't any left anyway, but future relationships. I had a complete cutoff with everybody. It was over. Even those that I hoped that I would have a relationship with in the future. Completely eliminated. I mean, what do you do? When you have nothing and you have nobody. You get on a plane, you fly out to Colorado with a handful of books and the clothes on your back, and you start over. That's what I did. You just start over. That's what you got. All right, one bag, and that's it. With nothing. All right, and I've got lots of practice with that over the years. Starting over and over and over again and over again. You get good at it after a while. All right? So, but are those consequences, and from a worldly point of view, those consequences sound severe, right? Okay, but from a spiritual point of view, in the relationship with our God, those consequences are nothing in comparison with the benefit that you obtain by living in reality, by living in what is real, by living with a real person. Those consequences are nothing. All right? I mean, I laugh about that now. I talked to my mother recently, for example, and she reminded me of a few things, and all I could do was laugh. Are you serious? I mean, you really think that means something to me? In comparison and in magnitude? You cannot threaten me. You cannot put me into slavery. You will never be my taskmaster, because the one who I have gives me more freedom and liberty than you can ever possibly suggest. Because I live in that which is real. All right? But this starts early for most people. For me, it happened much later. But, this should hopefully, if you love your children, start early with them. Okay? Start early. Build within them some sense of fortitude, some sense of self-control, discipline, these kinds of things. Because it'll make it easier, a lot easier, for a person to turn to that which seems brutal, seems incredibly hard. It's slavery of some kind. A restrictive life is what I got accused of quite often. People would say, we need to talk about this restrictive life you have. What are you talking about? You think you have freedom, you think you have joy, you think you have peace, you think you have, those things that meet the deepest needs that you have within you, but you don't. You live a lie. All right? You live in a lie, and there is a reality that that the Lord has called us to. So that's what I read when I read this. That the things people have done are taskmasters over my people. That you really need to get in touch with this, because at the end of this verse, after "and women rule over my people," those leading you are causing you to err, and the way of your paths have swallowed you up. Those who are leading you cause you to err. Those who are leading you, those are people who you want to lead you. It's not, you can't say it's their fault. It's nothing more than a statement saying that you have chosen to be led by these leaders. And you are the one who is really responsible for that. You will suffer the consequences for that. It will happen. And so assume the reality. Assume your responsibility that you truly have. And the way of your paths have swallowed you up. People will often do things for the now at the expense of what will happen in the future. They do that. And then the future comes and it just completely swallows them up. Religion, we have the same problem. In a lot of religion, people will use things like "the Lord is coming at any moment" as an excuse to do nothing for the future, or to have any consideration for the future. Are we to live day by day? Absolutely. But are we to live decade by decade? Absolutely. All right, but people will use that as an excuse to do nothing, and then eventually they get completely swallowed up and destroyed. They do this in the flesh, and there's no honor. There's no, people assume that there's some form of honor. Well, I live by faith. I live day by day. And I live without thinking about the futures, in order to have trust in God, in order to have faith in God. And when calamity strikes, there's no honor in that. The world around you, and even the people around you who are not part of the world, will see that and they will say, that wasn't a very smart thing to do. And you cannot expect God to absorb all these consequences and do something different. It just isn't going to work out. And when people do that, they just disappear. They become irrelevant very quickly. Very quickly. All right? So please, think about these things. Because if you don't, and you do not take action, not just with the things, take action in the sense of turning away from those things that are of the world, but turn to those things that are of the Spirit. If you don't take action, eventually it will swallow you up anyway. Does that make sense? So that's what he's talking about here. And I thought that it would be a great opportunity to refer to these things that have to do with our faith and to understand the magnitude of the challenges that people encounter. I wanted to talk about those things. All right. And I talked about the redistribution of faith. Okay, good. So I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover. Come back next week and I'll come up with something more. Wasn't that great for closing? Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this time that we can review the Scriptures and see how these things are relevant for us now and to see how these things have been relevant for all time. And Lord, I do pray that you'll give us some more insights concerning these things. I do pray that you'll help us to see how we may be living in this model of redistribution of faith, that we're living off of the faith of somebody else. That we will recognize that and that we will turn to you for the building of our own. And Lord, I do pray that you'll hear us concerning this and direct us more in this direction so that we may turn to you for who you are personally. And I thank you for this in Jesus' name. Amen.